Okay, this will be the third hour on Homer and hopefully the last. I don't want to stretch your patience. Um, there's so much, and I can't believe how much you could say. I hope that I've been able to show you that you could read Homer through these categories of Aristotle's poetics, his ethics, his politics, his de anima, and his metaphysics, just the general microcosm in a macrocosm, um, very fruitfully. You can, just about any scene, the people really are doing everything Aristotle said. They're engaging in the activities of soul in accordance with virtue and vice. And when they achieve the virtue, they flourish, their cities flourish, or would flourish if they had a chance, if they weren't having to deal with other people's problems. When they go to an excess, it's terrible, it's bad news. And the kinds of excesses they go to are described by Aristotle. And personal virtues have political implications, there's no real separation. Okay, so what I want to do in this one is finish up on Hesiod, his works and days, and how it applies to Homer, which is why I think these stories were being told at approximately the same time. They are getting woven together. It's just, there's no question that the works and days points toward um, the Iliad. So, at one point, so you have those two kinds of strife, and you have Prometheus, and Hesiod's story of Prometheus is that Prometheus did defy the gods, um, and then he told his little brother, and Prometheus means forethought, Epimetheus means afterthought. He told his little brother, don't accept any gifts from the gods. The gods got together Pandora and sent her as a gift, and Epimetheus accepted the gift, and she had this box, and she opened up this box, and it created all these problems. And that's why there's evil in the world. Well, so you can say, well, is the problem? It's another thing where, well, it's all your fault, Prometheus. You started it because you aggravated the gods. Or Prometheus can say, it's all your fault, Epimetheus. You accepted the gift. I told you not to do that. Or you can say, oh, it's all her fault. It's her fault. Well, you know what? If Prometheus hadn't done his thing, there wouldn't have been any Pandora. And if Epimetheus hadn't done his thing, there wouldn't have been any. So, are you going to blame the woman? These are old stories. Now, I do think there's no question that Hesiod has some quotes in there that are very misogynist in his works and days. I mean, he just says women are greedy, and if you're lucky, you can marry one that's not a bad person, and because you got to have kids for your old age. But in general, women are awful. Watch out for them. They're greedy. They'll eat you alive. You know, you'll have to work for them like a slave to make enough money for them. Um, I don't, and unfortunate. That's very unfortunate. But Homer, I do not think is that misogynist. Penelope has achieved a high level of dignity. Arete, the Phoenician city in the Odyssey, is the best city, and the queen is named Arete, which means excellence. So, and the princess is good. So there are a lot of very positive women characters in Hector's wife. Um, so I don't think um, Homer is that misogynist, and then I don't think a lot of the other tragedians and poets are either. But Hesiod, boy, he's got something against women, I think. Um, okay, so what else did Hesiod say, however, that really, I mean, there's no question you're supposed to weave together the works and days and Hesiod's theogony with Homer. Um, he says in the age, in the Iron Age. He goes through the Golden Age, the Silver Age. It doesn't really fit together. He says at the end of it, well, I'll tell you some more stories if you want to. He doesn't care about accuracy. He cares about the punchline. And he really cares about justice. He talks about this all the time. He's telling his little brother, keep your oaths, keep justice, don't be greedy, don't engage in that awful kind of strife, which is exactly the good advice for the people in the Iliad. But he'll say, in the Iron Age, that people start taking justice into their own hands, sacking each other's cities, no respect at all for the person who keeps his oath, the good man, the just man. No, they'll keep all their praise for the wrongdoer, the man who is hubris incarnate, right? A la Achilles. They honor Achilles more than Odysseus. It's what the hawk said high in the clouds as he carried off a speckle-throated nightingale, skewered on his talons. She complained something pitiful, and he said, no sense in your crying. You're in the grip of real strength now, and you'll go where I take you, songbird or not. Okay, might makes right. And that, again, is reminiscent of what people say in the Iliad. And then he says he has a section on justice, and he's very concerned for justice. And I really think this is 800 BC. It has dawned on Hesiod that there's this higher level of social evolution. He wants to be part of carrying forth this evolution. The fact that he's speaking as the voice of Prometheus, telling his little brother to keep oaths, is that he's continuing this tradition in the theogony of each generation having the virtues of Prometheus and being able then to evolve their societies, to take their generation and have their societies evolve positively and pass on that legacy to the next generation. So he says to his little brother, hubris is bad. It's the ultimate bad. Also, Oath, who's a god, keeps up with crooked verdicts, and there's a ruckus when the Lady Justice gets dragged through the streets by corrupt judges who swallow bribes and pervert their verdicts. So the importance of oaths, very much a theme in the Iliad. But when judges judge straight, for neighbors as well as for strangers, and never turn their backs on justice, their city blossoms, their people bloom. You'll find peace all up and down the land. All right, so this is what happened in the Iliad, is that they didn't keep their oaths, and they had, all these horrible things happen. In the theogony, the goal is to be that just ruler who judges straight, same word, for neighbors as well as strangers, and he can only do so because he hears these stories of the bards that tell him about all the ways people go wrong, so he can judge them fairly. And if you have this political association, you can have a higher quality of life. Life is not just survival, he says. When there's justice, people thrive on all the good things life has to offer, and they never travel on ships. The soil's their whole life. But for those who live for hubris and vice, Zeus, son of Cronos, decrees a just penalty, and often a whole city suffers for one bad man and his damn fool schemes. Reminds me of Troy, right? He may lay low their army. Zeus may lay low their army, or tumble down their city's walls, or sink all their ships at sea. And when Agamemnon aggravated Achilles, and Achilles got his mother to make the Achaeans suffer, the Trojans got all the way to the ships and started sinking the ships. So I think this clearly refers to the Iliad. And there's the virgin Justice, Zeus's own daughter, honored and revered among the Olympian gods. Whenever anyone hurts her by besmirching her name, she sits down by the son of Cronos, her father, and speaks to him about men's unjust hearts until the people pay for their foolhardy rulers' unjust verdicts and biased decisions. And that happens in the Iliad and in the Odyssey. Athena is talking to her father Zeus in the Iliad, and then she's sent Mentor to talk to Odysseus, and she's always advising Odysseus. Plan harm for another, and you harm yourself most. The evil we hatch always comes home to roost. The eye of Zeus sees all and knows all. You don't fool him one bit. So forget about hubris. And I think also in Hesiod's Theogony, he has Zeus is a natural power. So when you overstep the bounds, you'll pay the price. It's a karma. It's a lot like karma. But to men, Zeus gave justice, and that works out all to the good. If you know in your heart what's right and come out and say so, broad-browed Zeus will give you prosperity. But if you bear false witness or lie under oath and by damaging justice ruin yourself, your bloodline will weaken, your descendants fade out. Best of all is the person who sees everything for himself, who looks ahead and sees what will be better in the end. And that means Prometheus, forward looking. You've got to schedule your work. Wealth's better, not grabbed, but given by the gods. If a man lays hold of wealth by main force, he's in trouble. It's the same thing when somebody wrongs a suppliant or a guest. Hint, hint. Paris wronged a guest, or gets into his brother's bed and does with his sister-in-law what just ain't right. That's the house of Atreus. Theseus slept with Clytemnestra, his cousin's wife. Anyway, Zeus himself gets angry with a man like that, and in the end makes him pay for his wrongful acts. And then a whole lot of the works and days is about the farmer's year, how to deal with Demeter, sailing for trade, how to deal with Poseidon, and all of that. So I think that my main point here is that Hesiod wants to weave together the Iliad with his work, the Theogony, and if you do it that way, then you can read the Iliad as, here is every single way to go wrong. None of them got it right. And he's hinting at that. So I think that's interesting. Hesiod gives you the punchline, not Homer, which is very typical when you're educating nous. You put two and two together, but intuition is active, and it has to make the distinction. It's the aha. So educating for intuition is not giving people a set of doctrines. It's showing them and letting them figure it out for themselves, and then they come out with their logos, their explanation, and they're accountable for their explanation. And I'll talk about Delphi. The priests give the suppliants a riddle. They don't give them an answer to their question. And the way you interpret the riddle tells you about you. And you're responsible for how you interpret the riddle. Okay, so in the Iliad, just to wrap it up, you have the tale of two cities. Every young man, Paris, has to decide, is he going to go for power? Is he going to go for pleasure? And then as an older person, a young person who seeks power has physical prowess, and that's how he starts out getting power over the adults, is they depend on him. And then as an adult himself, he can act like Agamemnon, create more problems. The young man who seeks pleasure will start out with sex, create all these problems. As an older man and a father, he will be like Priam and create a ton more problems. So it's obvious that you should be like Athena, seek wisdom. When the bad guys are allowed to run a city, the best people suffer the most, like Hector and Odysseus, and the world is turned upside down. And so Hesiod understands the importance of justice, keeping oaths, all those themes, all the things he says in Works and Days are blatant in the Iliad. Now, I wanted to do a little bit more with the Odyssey. Um, so Odysseus in the Iliad, he has to leave home to take care of other people's problems. He tries um, with some success and some failure, more failure than success. But okay, finally they're heading for home. Well, the Achaeans sack Troy, so Odysseus is heading home, but Agamemnon tells him he has to go back to sacrifice to Athena because they know that they've done injustice. And they're afraid, right? Now they're afraid, oh my God, we're going to have to pay a price. Well, they did pay a price. Poseidon crashed a whole lot of those ships. Um, the main thing about Odysseus, though, is that I think is interesting, I'll just pick out a few things, is that the Iliad starts out with Agamemnon is the priest from Delphi, the god of reason, has come to get his daughter because Agamemnon is sleeping with his daughter in his tent. And Agamemnon won't do it. He says, I like her, she's nice, I even like her better than my wife, which is a really stupid thing to say. You're not supposed to do that. That itself is hubris. Women are supposed to simply be the spoils of war. And there's supposed to be, I think, some kind of civilizing influence for these men in these tents. He says she's weaving with me, and they have music, and I mean, I think they're trying to create the civilization, but it's truly a pseudo civilization. It becomes a power issue. So now Agamemnon has clearly taken a woman and violated a much more sacred covenant with the god of Delphi, international agreements. Delphi is the international center. So he's violated international covenant directly with the priest of Delphi when the entire, even the just cause for why he's there is because of violation of international law. But it's between two cities, and that's not as sacred as your duty to the gods and to the priest at Delphi. So already he's worse than his opponent. All right, got it. This is not. It's looking like this is not going to go anywhere good anytime soon. Um, and then they fight about, he takes Achilles' woman and they fight some more. So it's all about women and the problems that are created. Now, is it woman's fault? That's where Hesiod seems to blame the woman. It seems to me it's the guy's fault. And they're treating their women just like power. It's sexual politics. Agamemnon even says that after he takes Achilles' woman. He gives her back and says, I haven't even slept with her. Because it wasn't about sex, it was about power. Okay, so that's interesting because the woman issue is totally tied up in war. And one more point is that when Ares goes out and massacres people, Aphrodite goes, oh, that's so bloody. I just hate war. But, Aphrodite, you started the war. And so that denial that glamour, physical beauty leads to greed, and that leads to war. She's in total denial about that. And that's also the scene with Helen and Menelaus. They don't even want to think about it. They want to go back to their glamour and their beauty and not, make sure this time it's going to be tied to Hephaestus. And apologize for the mistake they made. They just act like they do it again. Menelaus would say, I do it all over again. Really. And the Telemachuses and the Odysseus of the world have to suffer, and Penelope all over again. You couldn't care less. Anyway, so so this is the contrast. In the beginning of the Iliad, they're having all these quarrels about women, and they're totally connected to war and aggression. In the beginning of the Odyssey, Odysseus is, you find out later, he's actually in Phoenicia, telling the story of his journeys. And he could have started anywhere, but he starts with being trapped on the island of Calypso. And Calypso is this beautiful goddess, totally gorgeous. They're on an island. She offers him immortality, to stay on the island and have sex with her. So this is the ultimate male fantasy, to be having sex with this beautiful, beautiful goddess, to be immortal yourself, to be able to do it for eternity, to have no responsibilities. You don't have any power, but you don't have any headaches either. And this is what Paris and Helen would have jumped right on it. Paris would have taken it in an instant. But Odysseus is telling the story, and he's saying the whole time he was whining and pining for home. So he learned his lesson, right? He had spent a year, I think it was, with Circe, a beautiful goddess, I guess. But he left. He learned his lesson, and so I think that's kind of it. Like, okay, we're not gonna. We're over that. So let's find out what a guy who gets over that goes on and does. Gets over the male sexual fantasy problem. So this one is about going home to his wife, marital fidelity. It's about exactly the opposite of what the Iliad is about, which was marital infidelity, obviously. The other thing about it, it's about family systems, and that's a big theme in Greek paideia, is you have three generations, the grandparents, the parents, and the children. And a whole family gets plagued by obsessions and extremes. So the House of Atreus, which I'll talk about more when I do the play, is about sibling rivalry, and generation after generation, they're plagued with that. They pass on that plague to the next generation. The Oedipus, the House of Laius, is plagued by the Oedipus complex, and I'll talk about that later. But the House of Laertes, Odysseus' house, is a just house, virtuous house, generation after generation. So you learn that Laertes was a just ruler, and you learn from the swineherd. Odysseus learned about his father from the swineherd, that his father had been, well, actually, Odysseus learns about himself, what the swineherd says about him, that he treated people well, and his father treated people well. And we have every reason to think that Telemachus is being raised by a good woman, and he too will treat his people well. And so the only reason Ithaca is not stable and flourishing is because somebody else created all these problems, and Odysseus had to leave. So one of the themes that comes out more in the Odyssey is the theme of justice pays, injustice harms. You pay a price for injustice and you get a reward for justice. But you have to have the big picture. It's generation after generation within a family, in spite of the things that other people do to lead you to have to suffer. It's not caused by your own character. It's caused by somebody else. The consequences that are actually caused by you and your character come out correct and justly in the end. Odysseus has three choices. He had the choice of staying with Calypso. That was his Aphrodite choice. He also had the choice to marry the princess of Phoenicia and have that power just be given a city that's well run and peaceful and wonderful, and then the choice of going back home to Penelope, um, and that was the wise choice, even though that was chaos and trouble. And even though when he went to Hades, he saw his mother, and his mother told him how awful it was, he still wanted to go back there, probably even more so. So, uh, Odysseus is a man who wants to be a complete human being. He doesn't want these fantasies. He doesn't want the sexual fantasy that's not human. He doesn't want um, this fantasy of being able to run a well run city and not really being challenged. He wants to go back and fix something that's broken and really challenge himself. And partly because it's his home, and partly because it's real. That's the way life is. You solve problems, and when you can take a city that's suffering and bring it back to stability, this is a much greater achievement, and this is worthy of honor, not fighting, not war, but the task that it's clear he's going to be able to accomplish by the end of the Odyssey is to bring peace to his city and prosperity, and that's the way it should have been for all of the city states and for all of the rulers. If they had been just, they all would have been forced to go to war, their cities would have declined, they go back home. But Agamemnon, that's not his fate, because of the way he killed his daughter, not just the fact, and I'll go into that, because of his arrogance and his ignorance. His mistaken understanding of what a good ruler is supposed to be like. But all of them, if they'd been just, they would have gone home, their cities would have been declining, but they would have reason to think that they could bring their cities back and be just and carry that on one generation to the next. So even if they did leave for a long time, but if they had good wives and good marriages, if they were faithful, then their children would be raised well, and their children would also be able to leave when somebody else makes a bad, does something stupid, and come home and reestablish order. So it's a very hopeful message. The Iliad ends with this incredible, like, war is totally stupid and pointless and just the most frustrating of all. And then the Odyssey ends with this message that to live a just life is to promote stability. And that is what Hesiod says too. The good person, ultimately, it pays, and injustice costs. Let's see. Then the other thing that's interesting about Odysseus is that he visits a lot of islands and a lot of cultures, and he thinks about them. He thinks about how they're ruled and if they're ruled for the sake of the ruled. And the other issue is his relationship to his fellow soldiers, sailors, and when sometimes he's just, he rules for their well-being. At least one point in his situation with the Cyclops, he blows it, and his troops suffer for that. Sometimes the troops treat him justly, and sometimes they treat him, or they act unjustly, and it costs everybody. When they opened up the bag thinking it was money and it was the winds, they were the ones that caused the setback. When they ate from the cows of the sun, they suffered. So it was just it. But there's a constant dynamic there between ruler and ruled, and that's just a great examples of what people are supposed to debate about. What the ideal situation is, what's better, what's worse, when they hit the mark, when they miss the mark, and why. let's see, the story of the Cyclops is really important because, um, okay, so Odysseus and his men get stuck. Well, they go into the cave and they hang around too long because there's food in there. And Odysseus says, we got to get out of here before the Cyclops come. And they hang around too long, and lo and behold, he comes before they can get out. And so he rolls a big stone in front of the cave. They're stuck. And then he goes and eats a couple of them for supper. And he's just keeping them around, and he's going to eat them all by the time he's done. Well, that's unjust, right? So Odysseus starts calculating. He starts using his Apollonian reasoning for a good cause because it's perfectly just for them to get out of there because this is perfectly unjust treatment. So he figures out how to get a log and make it into a point at one end, and make it sharp in a flame, and get the Cyclops drunk, and then he pokes out his eye with the log. Very, very clever, you know. Odysseus is clever, and that's great. Um, so then he straps his people underneath the sheep so that when the Cyclops tries to feel for these guys, he can't find them because he's taking his sheep out for to be grazed. Well, then you have just one left. Odysseus is left, and he manages to get himself wedged um, between the sheep. I can't remember quite how it works, but the Cyclops says, "Who's there?" And Odysseus says, "No one." And so when the Cyclops is blinded and he runs out to his friends and says, "Stop that man, stop these people, they've blinded me." And the other people say, "Well, who is it?" And he says, "It's no man." Then they laugh and they don't go after Odysseus because there's nobody there. So when Odysseus makes himself, this is the key, when he makes himself into no man, into nothing, he just, he doesn't have any honor, he's, he's nobody, then he wins. When he humbles himself, he succeeds. The trouble is, everybody knows this, he gets out into the ship, and they're heading out. Great. He cannot resist. He says, "Hey, Cyclops, you want to know who blinded you? Who really tricked you? Odysseus, son of Laertes." Boy, that was stupid for Odysseus to say that. That was pride. He overstepped the bounds. And that's every major culture, I think, has a story like that. Because they want to humble the people who have the most ability. Like Achilles, like Odysseus. When you have all that ability, you have the power to abuse it. And so it's very important to have these stories of these guys who were great or could have been great, but they overstepped. And Odysseus overstepped. And so the Cyclops tells his friend Poseidon, the god of the sea, to go after Odysseus and punish him. And that was why it took Odysseus many more years to get home, was because of that act of pride. And he endangered his sailors, but most of all, he endangered his city. He's not going to get home. He also was not home for his son, the whole second decade of his son's life, which were really important years. He could have been home by the time the kid was like 10 or 11. Nope. Telemachus left home before he even got there. He came of age. It was time for him to go look for his father. But that's an example, an important example of Odysseus having to get over his pride. Now, the other thing that's important is that it also shows you why the Greeks do not have the Ten Commandments. Virtue is not a logos. It's not a set of rules. It's not a set of definitions. Aristotle says that, look, I can give you the set of definitions, but this is not virtue. And people can, the trouble with giving bad people the definitions is they might think they're virtuous when they're not, or they might use the language of virtue to manipulate other people and use political rhetoric and get power because they know the language of virtue without being virtuous. Um, so anyway, Odysseus heads out, and he oh yeah, when he lied and said he's no man, that was the right thing to do. He hit the mark. And that whole process of how he got out of there was a great case of um, intelligence and calculation and being tricky like a fox. The wily Odysseus. But for the right reason, in the right way, he got his guys out of there. It was great. But, and he did it by lying. That was crucial. Then, when he got into the ship, he told the truth. And that was hubris. So you can't say, thou shalt not lie. Sometimes it's okay to lie. Sometimes it's the right thing to do. And sometimes telling the truth is the wrong thing to do. It's an act of pride. So that's why it shows you, it's a good example of why they don't have rules. Thou shalt not kill? No. Sometimes it's right to kill. And they're not pacifists. It was right for the Achaeans to go to war to preserve hospitality. It was better for them that Odysseus tried to negotiate a settlement first. But when the Trojans refused to give her back, then Athena was the one that kept the war going, because hospitality agreements, oaths, covenants, trust between city-states absolutely had to be preserved, or everyone would kill everyone. There would be perpetual war. Okay, the other thing that happened was that Odysseus was humbled more than once. And he was humbled when he ended up on the shore of Phoenicia naked. I mean, he had nothing. He had no ships, no men. He didn't even have any clothes. And that's when the princess found him. And he started telling his story, which is how the book begins. And the people didn't even know who he was. But they could tell that he had a good character. And they were willing even to let his daughter marry him. But that was where he had to prove himself. He had no name to go on. He didn't have any connections. He had no money. And so it was purely a meritocracy, right? Based on merit, that they perceived he had merit, and they could actually marry their daughter to him. Now, it was even more sign of his strength of character that he wanted to go home. He didn't want an easy life. He wanted his life, the human life, and his wife and his children. Okay, so then the other time he was humbled was, of course, when he got back to Ithaca, and then he had to disguise himself as a beggar. And the thing that's interesting there then is the swineherd Eumaeus was explaining to this beggar about Odysseus and his father. So by being nothing, he was able to understand people better, as I said before. And that's why you have Homer is telling you implicitly. That's why I'm telling you these stories, to help you understand people and the human condition, so that you can make good judgments. Let's see. Oh, the other big theme I wanted to talk about in the Odyssey was the notion of the bard, or the poet, and contrasting these. Okay, so the bard is starting to tell stories of all the suffering at Troy in Odysseus' house. And Penelope says, I don't want to hear the stories. I want the bard to leave. But his son Telemachus said, no, We need to listen to these stories. They're educational. Um, and then when you're in Phoenicia, the Phoenicians have a bard, and they listen to the bard. And the bard tells these horrible stories. But the Phoenicia is well ruled because it's ruled by the king that hears these stories and learns from these stories and learns how to nip things in the bud and how to deal with people and understands character and is not fooled, and all the many ways that the stories are trying to educate you to be a good ruler, an even headed, a level headed ruler, the opposite of all the stories that you hear. And then also that um, the bard tells a story of the myths, Aphrodite, Ares, and Hephaestus, and Apollo. And all of those are themes that really reflect back on the Iliad very well. Um, okay, then Athena. Okay, when Telemachus leaves home, this is important, I think. I think it's Athena that says this to him. She says, "Go and make for yourself a life in story." And so the idea is that you live in a way, okay? We're talking about not what you think about, but how you live. And this is ironic because scholars, right, people like me who pass these things down, don't live that much. We sit in our offices, we speculate, we try to pass this on, but mainly when I am doing a lot of writing and videotaping, I'm not living. I'm not actually, there's not much of a story. Martha Beck sat in her office for 20 years and did nothing in the city, nothing to help her society. And it bothers me because I did have 3 children, so for 20 years I was involved with my community. And there's a lot of compromise and a lot of growing up you have to do when you're dealing with people and your children are dependent on them. But it puts you in a different frame of mind than sitting in an office for 20 years and just passing on books. So it's important to always remember that you want to make for yourself a life in story. And the people who pass on these stories should also be making a life for themselves other than simply writing something down. But the main point here in the story is that Telemachus goes off and he sees Nestor and he sees Menelaus. But the first place he gets, I think it's Nestor, he hears a story about his father and his father's anger at Achilles. And it was rational anger. His father got angry at Achilles for the right reason and the right way. And that was the key. Achilles was the problem. And if Odysseus had been able to convince him, the war would have been over sooner. Plus, Odysseus got angry at Agamemnon. So basically, what Telemachus was going off to do was exactly what his father did. So he's keeping up the tradition. He knows that what's expected of him is exactly what his father expected of himself and what his grandfather expected of himself. And so the tradition is being passed down from one generation to the next. The other story I think about is when Telemachus gets to Helen, Menelaus' house, and I think I've mentioned this, but throughout when I think of the Odyssey, I think of the Phoenicians are sort of the standard of comparison. They're the city. It's possible for human beings to live in well-governed cities and to flourish. This is not a pipe dream. It's an attainable goal. These people enjoy life. They have a bard that educates them. we're not talking about asceticism. We're not talking about um, harps and, everybody happy in heaven. We're talking about attainable goals. And so you have the, but it's above average. Most cities don't live up to their potential, unfortunately. They don't flourish the way that they could because of corruption. But anyway, so we have the Phoenicians are better than most. And then you have I think the House of Helen and Menelaus is worse than most because it appears to be good. It's glamorous. Helen is still beautiful. It appears, but it's not. She was the one who got it started, and they act as if they would do it all over again. Right? They don't apologize to Telemachus. That just really throws me off. I'm sure other scholars don't react that way, but my argument for that is the critical importance of the whole Paideia tradition is it really wants to suck you in. It really wants you to identify with these characters and then to get really afraid. Like, I could do that. I could get sucked in. I could make that mistake. Because if it doesn't attract you, if you don't identify with it, you're not going to learn. So that's how I think the Phoenicians are better than most, and Helen and Menelaus are worse than most. And then Penelope and Ithaca are the intermediate ones. And one of the main reasons to be motivated, to be rational, be mindful, rule for the well-being of the ruled, don't commit hubris, like Hesiod says, is because all those intermediate people who did nothing wrong themselves have to pay this huge price. Their cities are ruined. Their families are exploded, divided apart, separated, just because of somebody else's mistakes. And that should motivate people not to make mistakes. And it should motivate people to motivate each other because they depend on each other. They flourish together or they suffer together. And we're all in it together. And we can't deny it. We can't separate ourselves from each other. This is the antithesis of rugged individualism. Every personal virtue has a social and political consequence, and every social and political spirit of the times has an effect on the person. It's still possible, no matter how much a city can get caught up in pleasure and wealth or power and glory, it's still possible for individuals to seek wisdom. But they don't do so as rugged individualists. That's not wise. They do so as mediators, right? When the wise person is going to be the mediator. Try to get these people, try to educate them, try to get them to compromise, try to get them to find nonviolent solutions to the problems that they created. So I just think I think I have tested your patience enough. I'm almost at 3 hours. That's a lot. It's way less than you could do with Homer. I mean, there's so much I didn't say. I was afraid that I wasn't being comprehensive enough. I think my poor audience, if they've hung with this, has had enough. But the summary, my way of encouraging people to read Homer would be read it through those filters of reversal and recognition, every possible way to go wrong, that you have to, it gives you 2 plus 2 You have to make it into four. However you interpret it is a reflection of your character. People are going to disagree because of the way it's written. They're going to try and educate each other when they're discussing their interpretations. Um, there's there are better and worse ways of living. These ways of living have extreme consequences for everybody else. Um, Aristotle's virtues and vices and his ethics and politics are implicit. The view of education as educating for intuition is implicit. Um, Jungian, the Jungian psychology about the shadow projection, having a complex, identifying with a complex, is all there. The goal is, as Jung says, individuation, assimilating the shadow, taking all that energy, that negative energy, and making something positive and creative with it. There's archetypal psychology can be used very fruitfully to understand the Iliad and the Odyssey. So the filters are Aristotle, archetypal psychology, Greek mythology, and ultimately the correspondence theory of truth, that the mind, the wise person, is a microcosm in the macrocosm, and their mind should reflect the truth about the human condition and also their choices. They literally make the truth incarnated. Human beings create history and culture, but they can make a mistake. Just because they create history and culture doesn't mean they're free to create anything they want. If they overstep the bounds in relation to nature and in relationship to their own nature, pleasure, pain, fear, anger, all of that, they will pay a price. And the price will come in the natural world. There'll be this, when they overstep the bounds, whatever's been wounded, nature or another person, is going to compensate in order to try and regain the equilibrium in nature, or take revenge at the other extreme among human beings. And then also, every generation is more evolved than the previous one. So there has to be this passing on of the torch from one generation to the next. And again, when people are corrupt, that process is totally corrupted, as it was with the Achaeans and with the Trojans. But in the case of Telemachus and Odysseus and Laertes, the torch was passed, and it was passed peacefully. And the only real problems were the problems of dealing with irrational people and trying to solve the problems that they created. Okay, and I think that's probably enough. You've probably heard enough from me.